This is Real History with Melissa, and today is the 19th of March, 2026, and I am really excited today that I am going to be speaking with Dr. James Giordano and how this came to be. You have heard me talk about Dr. Giordano before. I have played you full presentations by him, and in full disclosure, I said, I told people this is very dystopian, and so I just need to let you know that up front. But what happened is I was watching him present to big groups, the Naval Academy and military, West Point, and I thought, okay, that's what he does. And then I saw him on some smaller podcasts, and I said, what if? What if he would talk to me? Nah, those people, they know somebody. They know somebody who knows somebody. And so I said, well, let's just send him an email. Now, for all of his credentials and the letters behind his name and his education and background, what impresses me most is that I sent him an email and 17 minutes later, I got a reply. And he said that he would be happy to come on the podcast and talk to me, and that impresses me. But I want to quickly, I was so intimidated by my notes. I said, okay, I've really honed it down and I can just zero in on a few important questions. And when I printed it out yesterday, I saw that my zeroing in on the important stuff totaled 15 pages. But then I was happy to realize that the first three were just your credits, yeah. So I'll start by saying that Dr. Giordano is a neuroscientist, neuroethicist, and professor emeritus at Georgetown University Medical Center. Now, I will link to his bio. I will link to lots of talks by him, so you can check this out for yourself. He is called often an emeritus. So that's somebody who has served us well, served the community, served the military, served his university very well, and they have put him out to pasture in the nicest possible way and let him keep his title. So there are lots of things that he is still currently involved in, and I think the main thing that you're doing right now is that you're the director for the Center for Disruptive Technologies and Future Warfare at the National Defense University. Now, welcome.
It's a pleasure. It's a true pleasure.
Good. I really am happy to be talking to you. And I think, so we had a little bit of back and forth. And I said, I've watched a lot of your videos. I've read some of your papers. I think your bio says you've written about 300 of them. You sent me a few things to concentrate on. And you also gave me a working title here. You said, let's call this Brain Games, the Barter and Battle for the Mind. And you suggested neurotechno-economy, cognitive enhancement and warfare and neuroweapons. And so all my notes, everything that I prepared, and I thought, you know what? Let's start and let's do some disruptive technology here. Let's disrupt my own thinking and start in the middle. I saw you speaking to a few military gentlemen, a couple of them actually, on a show. I don't remember the name of their podcast, but the name of the episode was The Battle for Your Mind, Neuroscience, Technology, AI, and the OODA Loop.
Mhm.
You talked about fifth generation warfare, non-kinetic, influential, liminal warfare. Some of these things I have questions about, including liminal warfare. But you said something that I thought was a good starting point here. You said the informed public has not remained in step with what the science and technology are capable of doing. And so I have a couple of questions. Why is that? Are they not informed then? Or is there some kind of cognitive disconnect because of the speed with which things are moving?
S- Actually, so I think it becomes super important to understand that the pace of contemporary science and technology is very, very rapid. If we were to look when I first got into the field, and that emeritus title just means that I'm old. I've been a brain scientist for 45 years, right? So when I first got into the field, the pace, the span of relative translation to go from an idea to an instrument or from a concept to a construct was about 10 to 15 years, right? Today, it's less than 5 years. And there are a number of reasons for that. The ubiquity of information and the tools that allow that, the use of machine learning and AI, the integration of science and technology across a number of both disciplines and domains. And I think the globality of it also affects particularly different paces. And there are a number of reasons for that, not least of which is that different nations have different values and different priorities, and they may accelerate or decelerate the pace and or the scope of what their research and its translation into various applications may be. But I think that pace is important to understand because it is very, very rapid in its translation from what may be an idea to what may then be a usable instrument in a variety of different applications. I think very often the lowest hanging fruit is always some definable good. What good can we do with this? But this too opens a proverbial Pandora's jar because what is necessarily good for me might not necessarily be good for you, and different groups, cultures, nations, even individuals define those goods in accordance to the things they value, the things they need, even in some cases the things they fear and seek to defend. So to your question, I think first and foremost is the pace is so rapid that the translation is such as just when the public might get its head around, well, we're doing this. Well, now that has become not the latest and greatest, number one. Number two, it's very difficult, I think, in these days of ubiquitous information for the public to parse what may be fictional from what is fact and or what represents reality from what may be some construct, right? Some perhaps irrational construct. And that's happened always. That's not new, but I think what's happened now is the depth and the breadth of that has become somewhat more profound because, again, the ubiquity of information and the access to that the public has. So I think there is a defined mission to be able to provide factual information based upon ground truths as to what is actually capable and not capable in science and technology, and what are the abilities and what are the limitations of the science and tech, who's using it for what, but also how those limitations perhaps spark innovation, invention, and in some cases, movement towards various interventions.
Well, why don't we start then with some of the technology and neuroweapons that you're able to talk about, that are disclosable to the public. And I think a few things that come to mind there are things that you have said in talks that you've given, at least going back to 2018. There in one talk, you talked about you pulled out a pen and you said you've got this tiny little thing and this toxin can be released and it can affect everyone in this room, which was a large auditorium, or actually even larger. And so it's concealable. And you were talking at the time about aerosolized nanoparticles as a viable weapon. Now, you said we're not there yet, but we're almost there. That was, I think, about 8 years ago now that you gave that presentation. Where are you on that kind of weaponry that we're able to hear about?
A good question. So I think the best place to start is to formally define a weapon. We take a look at the Oxford English Dictionary. Weapon can be described as means of contending against others. It's not axiomatic to that discussion or that definition that it needs to necessarily be harmful.
Yeah, yes, I've heard you talk about someone's smile as being disarming, or
Yeah,
or their
quite
eyes.
frankly, yeah, I mean, and other things. I mean, realistically, I think anything that allows one to influence others in ways that are beneficial to the individual who's yielding the weapon.
Hmm.
So we can talk about things like soft weapons that are those things that are influential and in some ways may perhaps change an individual's focus, change their particular attributes, change the things they value, change their attitudes, and do that in very subtle ways, or do that in ways that might be initially overt, but not necessarily or at all harmful. So, I mean, this gets back to an older concept, one I think that can relate all the way back to Buddha, and one that Abraham Lincoln was rather fond of saying, is that if I take my enemy and make them my friend, I have an enemy no longer. So, in some cases, what we're really talking about is weapons that are influential weapons, weapons that may be used for deterrence for others' violent or volatile postures. I think that still opens up some discussion as to, well, are there rules and regulations how these things could be used? Does that perhaps represent more harm than not, even though you're not harming necessarily someone physically, you're changing their ideas and their essences? So all of those have generative discussions about the relative value, the relative probity, are there rules, what's harmful, what's burdensome, etc.
When you're
But I think
talking,
if
oh, sorry,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead. No,
So,
go ahead.
but if you think about, I mean, we're talking about neuro weapons. I mean, realistically, now we're talking about anything can quote weaponize anything that works on the nervous system. So this opens up a much broader palette. So what we like to talk about are some of the things that are more classical neuroweapons, right? Not necessarily things like bullets and bombs that certainly, let's face it, somebody takes a round through the head, that's a neuroweapon. Hit somebody over the head with a stick, that's a neuroweapon. We recognize that. But let's take it up to a higher level of sophistication. So now we're talking about things like drugs, bugs, microbes, viruses, bacteria, in some cases fungi, toxins, and these have come into, I think, very recent view, given that our European allies just brought to light that Russian opposition leader Alexander Novotny was in fact poisoned through the use of uh, an organic toxin that is derived from the skin of a poisoned tree dart frog.
Hmm.
And as a consequence of that, it now has come to light, well, they probably didn't go to the jungles to actually scrape off or milk the secretions of this frog. This was synthetically manufactured. So there are a number of toxins, and very, very recently at the Atlantic Council, I had the honor and privilege of taking part in a panel discussion dealing with the availability of these toxins. So you have drugs, bugs, toxins, devices, inclusive of things like directable energies, sonic energies, electromagnetic frequencies, etc., and also data. And the weaponization of information, of data, the more I know about you, the more I may be able to manipulate what I know about you and do those in ways that are affecting you, particularly if it is data about your neural system, your brain and what your brain does, your functions of thought, emotion, behavior, choices, decisions. Well, this vulnerabilizes you as well, particularly when you then pair each and all of those with machine learning and AI. So the weaponization of the very powerful tools of the brain sciences across a range of potential weapon palettes, from things that are influential, soft weapons, inclusive perhaps of economics on the world stage, drugs, various devices that can be leveraged in this way to gain economic hegemony and create dependencies, to things that are far more kinetic and far more overt. But let me back up just one step, if I could. You asked, where are we now with specific regard to something like aerosolizable nanomaterials? Well, I mean, we understand that the viability, the value of nanomaterials to create scaled, very, very small scale sensors and transmitters that can be implanted within the nervous system without surgical intervention or minimal surgical intervention represents a viable step that we're seeing in the biomedical and translational sciences. But these same techniques and technologies can also be used to implant nanomaterials for disruptive effects. But, but to amend something that I said to a working public in 2018 about, well, a capful of this would be able to do X, Y, or Z. I think that the public needs to understand it's a slightly different perspective. And what I mean by that is when looking at these neurological weapons and so forth, it's not so much a question of these as weapons of mass destruction, but rather weapons of maximum disruption with regard to individuals and collections of individuals. So now what we're seeing is the ability to be very, very precise and very, very specific in definable ways so as to be far more sharp shot in approaches rather than buckshot or bomb in approaches.
So when you're talking about soft weapons versus hard weapons, soft weapons, as I understand you put it across, would be economic, and then that is PSYOPS, is that's a soft weapon. And the
So
hard weapons are bugs, drugs, toxins, devices.
here too, PSYOPs, I think, takes on a slightly different perspective as well, because these days, the buzzword, but it's a real construct, is something called cognitive warfare. And cognitive warfare is not just psyops on steroids. It really takes on a broader vista, a broader aperture. A lot of the work that was done with NATO back in 2016, 17, 18 really was fundamental in establishing that prototypic definition of what cognitive warfare entails and obtains. And what cognitive warfare is an approach that appreciates the human being as a biological, psychological, and social entity. We can't ignore our biology. Our biology, our nervous system is one of those systems of relationality, how we process information, how we generate feelings, responses, etc. We exist in a social environment. We certainly are in interaction with others on a variety of levels, virtually, personally, communally. And that environment also has physical factors that determine what our sociologies are, how close, how distant we are, what is the stability of that environment, what are resources and services that may be available, how do we cooperate or compete for those. And we engage with our environment psychologically. We take that information in psychologically and we respond psychologically as the basis of our thoughts, flavored by our emotions that then ultimately dictate our decisions and actions. So, what cognitive warfare seeks to do is to appreciate that biopsychosocial reality of the human person as viable, targetable entities, dimensions, and domains, and can do so interactively through information, through a variety of different means of affecting environments and perceptions of those environments, or perhaps even directly by affecting the nervous system to create certain biases, dispositions, vulnerabilities and volatilities that then make individuals more or less susceptible to particular types of information and environmental conditions.
Okay, I want to bring the camera way out, way up above and get a kind of a bigger picture there. I looked at what you're cognitive warfare, no, not those terms, but PSYOPs, MISO, that was a new one on me. I put MISO used on Americans domestically and see if I can come up with what my web browser returned to me. It was kind of amusing. Uh, it said, miso is used in American cooking more and more. So,
Brilliant.
yeah. So
I love it.
I then had to qualify it and add, okay, military miso used domestically. So my quick little survey of that said that psyops as a term fell out of favor because it has connotations of brainwashing and indoctrination and that kind of thing that the public has gotten a look, don't do that to me. And so they used miso, but now they brought psyops back in. And so I took a quick look at the Smith-Mundt and the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act to see, okay, no, the military can't use that domestically. So don't get panicked. They don't do that to you. But then I saw an interesting thing that says the act doesn't apply to intelligence agencies like the CIA and the FBI. So that's okay. They can use that domestically. And it also made me think immediately of a book I read years ago called The Cultural Cold War, the CIA and the world of arts and letters, which is, just kind of lets you know that yes, these agencies might be doing things domestically. They might be doing things to enemy targets that nonetheless affect you domestically. But taking our own government and all of the alphabet agencies behind it, can I assume that these cognitive warfare techniques are being used on me right now by some other government, some other enemy, if you will define them that way? Is that a safe assumption?
I think that the assumption, at very, very least, is that other governments, both state actors as well as perhaps state actors that are employing non-state actors as potential proxies, and independent non-state actors that might be working with regard to various terrorist organizations, are very keen to try to understand the role that data and information play upon the sentiments and behaviors of targeted individuals and collectives. So I think at very, very least, the assumption that others are looking at what could be done and how it could be done, and certainly the assumption that there have been ongoing attempts to do so would be very, very realistic and I think truthful.
And I think in terms of information warfare, that is the most interesting to me. But I wasn't even going to bring up Havana Syndrome because you've covered it with other people. It's well covered, and people can look that up and find other videos. However, I noticed it's back in the news again. So 60 Minutes did another piece on it. It would appear that there's some new revelation. I think whistleblowers against the CIA, but most interesting in terms of the technology is that the Pentagon obtained a little device that beams weaponry. I understand that they're reverse engineering it to figure out what it is and how it works, but they purchased it from a criminal Russian organization for, I think, 15 million US. So is that an example of the relative inexpense of doing something that can be incredibly harmful physically to people?
Can't speak to the reverse engineering of a particular device or the obtaining of a particular device. I mean, the way I characteristically will speak about any of these things where I have subject matter expertise in any form, whether it's
Mhm.
public or private, are those things that I have direct knowledge of. Right? So moving outside of that discussion to, I think, the larger point is that are such things exemplary of the scalability of
Right.
these technologies that would allow their clandestine or covert use? Yes, absolutely. I mean, what I have to add to that is that the discussions we've been having in our formal reports to the Department of Defense, in some cases related intelligence agencies, State Department, and then, of course, more broadly disseminated publicly, is that these technologies are at a viable readiness level that allows them to be scaled, fielded, and therefore operationalized in ways that would render them less than overt. In other words, you're not going to see a pickup truck with a big sort of resonating dish in the back parked across the street from your house. That scalability allows the relative shrinkage of these types of devices to be far more, quote, in close and personal, once again, targeting individuals versus having a mass effect, and allowing that to be done, that targeting of individuals to be done clandestinely, at least, if not covertly at worst. So I think to your point is spot on in that the way you see the technologies working these days is not necessarily that they're having an ever more mass capability of weapons. There are plenty of things in weapons caches and armamentarium that are capable of doing that. Characteristically, a variety of just classical explosives that range from things that can be rather small to huge. And of course, the idea of a nuclear arsenal, both strategic as well as tactical. But this is different. This now deals with high value targeting of individuals or groups of individuals in ways that makes attribution difficult. And as a consequence, in that attribution, not only the who done it, but what they done it with, then also makes postures of retribution equally problematic. And that represents sort of the new face of these types of engagements.
That is an interesting point that I've heard you talk with several people about is it can't be attributed. The weapon is used and you can't attribute you can't find the perp. That's there,
Again, at very least, what these types of things, and here, I mean, we could even be more encompassing if you want to talk about the new palette, the new toolkit of very specific drugs that can be delivered at very low doses, very specific bugs that can be tailored using things like synthetic biology and gene editing to create essentially precision pathologies that are going to affect a particular individual or group of particular
Mhm.
individuals. The idea of specific devices that can be scaled to a very, very small scale that allows individual use, again, if not secretively, at least covertly at most. What this then allows, again, is a perpetrator to be able to perp this, to do this, and at least get out of there. So they're not right there.
Mhm.
So these new armamentaria, this new toolkit of potentially weaponizable science and technology, allows for a very, very different approach. In other words, now it's not a question of here's a definable enemy that you can see even over the horizon that is then doing this to affect a lot of people. This is a far more insidious approach that would allow the perpetrator to engage this event, target you, and then get out of there where there's a latency period where then you're not quite sure what's
Mhm.
happening to me. Is it something that was done to me? And then it also engages others that then commits resources, time, services, money to be able to discern, is there something there, or is there not? And then when it becomes more apparent that, yeah, there's something there, what is it? Then trying to remedy what was there. And then it comes up with the question, well, who done it? And very often the nature of these types of weapons is that they leave a very, very low attribution signature that can fade with time and therefore makes attribution difficult, particularly in the absence of the proverbial smoking gun.
This weapon that was purchased by the Pentagon from the criminal organization, it was described on 60 Minutes as being about that big, that allowed them to use at a distance, but close enough to cause harm. And as what you're talking about, uh, get themselves removed from the scene. It's about that big.
You know,
It's
again, it really depends on. There's a lot of things that are about that big
yeah, or
or smaller.
smaller.
I mean, realistically, if we consider injecting someone
Hmm.
with a single dose of a very, very potent designer drug, the injector is exceedingly small. It can be done basically by brushing up against them, by putting some type of a gel on something they're going to drink, putting it as a transdermal on something they're going to touch. The same is true with regard to some of these nanomaterials we talked about. The same is true, for example, with very, very specific pathogens that I'm not concerned about infecting a number of people, only concerned about affecting you or people like you. But when we come to devices, inclusive of those that may be sonic or those that work across the electromagnetic frequency spectrum, what we're really seeing is that the boon has not been that we can affect a number of people through the use of a very gross, largely determined device. We've had those for a long time. I mean, certainly for a long time. The ability to generate electromagnetic frequency, that can be disruptive or destructive, to work across the acoustic spectrum in ways that are disruptive or destructive. This isn't new. But what is new is the scalability, once again, to be able to shrink these things down to now allow far more in close and personal engagements that can be far more obtuse, far more covert, and as a consequence, incur a lot of problems when it comes down to the who done it, what they done it with, and then what do we do about it?
I want to talk a little bit about in close, and also you said targeting specific. Are you talking, you mentioned at one talk, I think, genetic profiles of individuals and groups and genomics. Is that an example of how you're targeting an individual
Oh, yeah,
with
certainly. I mean, yeah,
that?
let's face it. I mean, the old idea that knowledge is power, that's quite true. And the more knowledge that is available about you across the range of the reality that makes you you. We talked about the biopsychosocial triune of what any person is. Well, the more I know about your biology, the more I can target specific aspects of that biology with a variety of different things. Drugs, certainly, bugs, perhaps, various technologies that may act at weak points in that biology. The more I know about you psychologically, what do you like? What do you not like? What frightens you? What favors you? What types of things make you more amenable and friendly? What types of things do you find to be perhaps repulsive, disgusting? Well, I can appeal to those sentiments in a variety of ways. Images, narratives and stories, various semiotics. And the more I know about your social environment, the more I know what you buy, where you go, your interactions, your social interactions, what media you consume, the more I can then engage those social dynamics in ways that are selective for you, that affect you psychologically in terms of what you're perceiving and what you're not, and how that psychology then feeds back onto your nervous system to affect your physiology and your responses. So we can see that that level of selectivity increases as a consequence of the availability of information, which is why one of the things that our group has called for repeatedly over the past decade, and here I refer to a lot of the work that I've done with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Diane Diulis, is the need for increased scrutiny, stringency, and rigor in what we call bio-cybersecurity. In other words, making sure that individuals' data about their bio, psycho, social realities, preferences, choices, and actions are held in secure custodianship and provenance so as to avoid these things being purloined by nefarious actors.
Okay, too many questions in response to what you were just saying have popped into my head, but I'll try to work backwards there. You talked about the and something that I heard you say, you talked about how one of the weapons that could be used is someone accessing your medical record, and then they can change it. They can make you a diabetic when you're not. They can give you a whole different profile. This is a kind of weapon so that you don't receive the care that you need, or you receive care that actually kills you, or it takes you out of contention for a job or a promotion because you're deemed to be unfit. And now, to me, that just sounds like hacking. It- But is there another element to it?
It's biohacking.
Yeah,
It's bio data hacking. So again, I think that it's not a question of, oh, this is brand new. No, it's not
right.
brand new at all. It's how you take, if you will, these older tricks and you fold them into a larger campaign. You fold them into a larger playbook. What's happening is, again, the availability and relative access to these types of data are increasing as a consequence of the availability of the data itself. So the more data that's out there, if you will, about you, about me, the more is the need for holding those data secure. And of course, the nature of these data is that these data are not only in data nodes, they also have to connect to other nodes. In other words, we network our data so as to be able to use them in effective ways, to access various types of our data to various resources that require those data in either real or asynchronous time. And one of the adages that's been around for a while, but that still holds true, is that if these data cells and these actual these datum, each one of the data are stackable, where now you have nodes of data in one domain, your purchasing data, coupled with data of other things in your credit card, coupled with your social media, coupled with your health records. The stackability of those data render those stacking points more vulnerable to hacking. And then it really is just a question of what that hacker seeks to do with those data. Do they manipulate the data themselves so as to create a data profile of you that is not accurately representative of you, and then the incumbent responsibility falls upon you to disprove that. And the more data I change that is in coordination with what I've hacked, in other words, it's not just data about you, it's data about the friends you interact with, your history, your family. Well, now the incumbent responsibility is upon you to disprove that because data is demonstrable. And now I have multiple sources of data that's saying, no, this is the truth. And you're saying, no, 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 it's this.
Mhm.
Really? Prove it. But the other thing is that if I have these data about you, and these data are multidimensional, well, I can then access not just the information, but what the information represents. Aspects about your physiology, aspects about your psychology, aspects about your preferential choices, aspects about your medical history, aspects about you. And each one of those things may then become vulnerable to purloinment somehow, whether by means of changing and altering the data or using those data to develop particular tools that can directly interact with each and all of those domains.
At one point in one of your presentations, you took out a cell phone and said to your audience, you do this yourselves. If you're using this, if you're going on 23andMe or any of these genealogy sites, you said you're providing the information that gives the most comprehensive picture of you imaginable. And that's certainly something to consider. However, the system is designed that it's harder and harder to not participate.
I mean, you're
So,
exactly right. Number one, it becomes harder and harder for us not to become data engaged because, again, to repeat myself, the ubiquity of information provision, access, and in some cases, necessity. I mean, realistically, these days, let's face it, it's almost impossible to do anything without the need for at least some level of data engagement or engaging with some information processing system. I mean, if I call my pharmacy and I just want to find out their hours, I have to deal with their data system. If I want to find out
mhm.
if my prescription is ready, if I call my healthcare provider, if I'm trying to make a reservation at a restaurant or to get my car fixed, all of these things are data intensive and information exchangeable and
Mhm.
need to have some level of provenance and custodianship. Even something as simple as where I'm going and what my schedule is, where I'm paying tolls across a particular day, logs back to what mechanism I'm using to pay those tolls, what account, and therefore a party actor might be able to say, this is my route these days at this time,
Mhm.
which then allows me to have relative targetability. So, along with the idea that we're becoming more data usable, more data reliant, more data dependent, comes the equal demand and obligate responsibility for us to become more data secure, more data protective, more data defensive. Double edged blade. Why? Because then it asks the question, well, who's minding the data? And then the question is, well, to mine the data, we basically, to mind, to oversee the data, we have to see the data or at least know the different domains of the data. This then becomes an element of trust. Well, what organization or organizations are doing this? Do we trust those organizations? Are those organizations secure unto themselves? And very often, if you go up that chain, you move out of commercial entities because there's always the chance that a commercial entity might be bought out and that information might be acquired. We may not necessarily know who's buying out who and what that level of provenance and or custodianship is with second or third party actors. So we then come back and say, well, perhaps the most likely candidate for this type of stewardage, this type of oversight and security is the government. Arguably so. I mean, and you're talking to someone who is, in fact, a United States government employee. But I think the reality of that is that the American people over the past 30 or 40 years have become increasingly mistrusting of government, in some cases for good reason. But I think that the idea that, quote, the government needs to watch, to literally oversee. I mean, let's face it, if you want the government to be the watchdog, then the government needs to watch. That creates suspicions of a panopticon. And then
Mhm.
the question is, who's protecting me from my protectors? What are they going to use this for? And it is complicated. I mean, I think it necessitates the importance of these types of guidelines and governances that are in fact transparent, that allow that level of safety, security, oversight, and watchfulness for protection, and at the same time allow a measure of transparency and governance and control that will allow the public to feel secure in the security that's being leveraged upon them for their safety.
Going back to information warfare and how we can assume that that is being used on us, I heard you mention, see if I can find it here, um, a DARPA program called Narrative Networks. And you mentioned, I can't remember the gentleman's name now that was involved in doing that, but it's the Narrative Networks program is a research initiative launched to understand how narratives influence human cognition, behavior, and identity, particularly in the context of international security. So this is analyzing on the biological or neurobiological front. It's how does a narrative, this is a story, a narrative is a story. So, how does it affect your hormones, your neurotransmitters, your reward processing, your emotion cognition interactions, and then the creation of models and simulations to see how the narrative is influencing you in real time. So, is this kind of a program an example of the cognitive warfare? Not that this necessarily has a warfare application, but is this an example of that?
I mean, well, look, let's be very transparent. I mean, this was a DARPA initiative, and the
Right,
D in DARPA stands for defense. And I had the great
right.
privilege and honor working with a colleague of mine, Dr. William Casebeer, who was the program manager on the Narrative Networks project, which was oriented exactly as you have described it. Now, again, I think it's very important for your participatory audience to understand this isn't exactly new. I mean, one can take a look at, for example, propaganda as a very viable motion in the idea of creating narrative networking. How is it that we can spin a story? And the story is not the narrative, but the story is composed of various narratives. How can we take those narratives, which is the verbiage, the intonation, the prosody, how we say certain things, how we present certain things as part of a story, and use those narratives to gain effect in who are going to be the recipients of what that story and or varieties of the narrative, symbologies, semiotics, or iconographies may be. And the more we know about who we're looking to appeal to, the more we can, quote, flavor that appeal. So on one hand, we can look at the political level to things like propaganda and messaging that has happened throughout human history. Characteristically, we'll think about depicting the other, the individual who may be the enemy or the potential foe or the adversary or peer, in ways that are far less desirable than we project and depict ourselves. We know that. But I think one can also then look at something as subtle and seemingly benign as marketing and advertisement. So, understanding what makes people tick, if you will, understanding what makes people happy, what makes people engage, what makes people desirous of a variety of things. To reiterate, what things frighten them, repulse them, anger them, push them to the point of being volatile. Well, what are those, quote, triggers? And what you've seen is a sophistication that's gone from simple behavioral observation. If I do X, you do Y. If you do Y, then I do Z. This is what gives the result. To things that are far more psychological, trying to understand the underlying, literally psychological processes. In other words, what is it that makes people think certain ways? How are these thoughts related to sort of larger thought constructs, emotional constructs, and how do these things then funnel in the final common pathway of behavior? But certainly the sophistication of those fields has more recently, over the past 40 to 50 years, included the brain sciences. And so now the idea of the neurocognitive sciences have played a larger and increasing role in that. Not as a standalone, but as yet another prong in that sort of multi pronged approach to being able to influence others through a variety of symbols, words, meanings, conveyances that are, on one hand, advertising and marketing, and as you sort of move along the spectrum of effect, propaganda, cognitive engagement, cognitive warfare. So, yeah, I mean, the more we understand on a variety of levels, from the neurobiological level, in other words, what types of stimuli that people are experiencing will change their brain state, to change their bodily state, to change their cognitive and emotional state. What are those representative stimuli, signals, symbols, words, how the words are used together, the tone of the words, who's saying these things, in what context, the more specific we can be in those influence campaigns.
So, in group, out group is a concept that applies across a whole spectrum of studies. But there was a study that was done, I think maybe 2012, on oxytocin. And specifically, it was done with the military. But oxytocin, it's a hormone. A mother releases that when she's breastfeeding. It's bonding between mother and infant. And they were studying oxytocin in creating an in-group feeling with soldiers so that they would bond with one another and they would also bond against the outgroup. And when you're talking about up close delivery, and staying on weapons here for just a few more minutes, you said there could be something that you put on the rim of a glass or whatever it would be, so that you've got someone, he's your adversary. He comes into a meeting, say you're negotiating, and you put that on the rim of his glass. Don't drink at a meeting. So that's, but, and he drinks that and he leaves the meeting with a exactly what oxytocin could produce, or I'm sure many, many other drugs, where all of a sudden you're not perceived by him to be the enemy anymore. You're his bestie. And he just loves you, and he goes out and tells all his people, his followers, whatever, his men, oh, he's not so bad. I don't know what I was thinking. And, we're all good now. We're cool. Now, I'm assuming that the effects of something like that would wear off.
So
But
let me sort of sharpen the point of that a bit.
all right.
I mean, there's been a lot of hype that oxytocin is, quote, the love hormone, right?
Right.
Not really. I mean, first of all, we have to remember oxytocin does a number of things in a body, not least of which is that it prompts smooth muscle contraction. And so, organisms tend to be, they tend to be sort of effort sparing, if you will. So very often what you see is that a particular neurohormone or particular chemical does a lot of different things based upon how and where it's released in the body. And in this particular case, smooth muscle contraction in various smooth muscles, gut, genitalia, breast tissue, can also be coupled with various emotions that may be useful or viable and valuable in those particular scenarios and environmental conditions and contexts. So you're absolutely right. So something like the hormone oxytocin, neurohormone oxytocin, indeed is released when mothers are breastfeeding a child. They're released when individuals have certain types of physical contact. There are key, not necessarily erogenous zones, but high stimulatory zones and certain types of interactions that will actually prompt the release of oxytocin. Well, what does that make you feel? I mean, you'd have to pretty much give someone a bath in this stuff to have an overwhelming effect. But that's just the point. It's not an overwhelming effect. It can be very subtle.
Hmm.
And there seems to be at least some dose dependency. Now, how we might give someone oxytocin, well, there's a lot of variables there. Again, the type of hormone it is, it degrades pretty quickly outside of the body. And as you've said, even within the body, it's broken down pretty quickly. But again, with some of the newer techniques of synthetic biology, the ability to modify, if not the hormone itself, the carrier vehicle that allows it to sort of stay stable and therefore be administered in a variety of different ways, aerosolizable, for example. Again, on the rim of a glass, if the glass is heated, it becomes aerosolized, vaporous. You breathe it in, which is a very quick way to get oxytocin on board. Might that be influential? Sure, it might be influential. Is it really going to flip a switch where your enemy 5 minutes ago is now your loving bestie? Now, that might be extreme, but could it change certain dispositions and or sentiments or feelings about an interaction? Sure. Are there other ways to create various neurochemical shifts in that individual to potentiate that? Things that are fairly subtle. Literally, environmental cues, colors, sounds, smells. Yes, absolutely. Have we known this for a long time? Of course we have. What's happening is the toolkit is getting far more sophisticated, getting far more capabilized as a consequence of what we're knowing about individuals' biology that might allow manipulation of their environments and or effect upon their psychology in ways that has cognitive effect, that is able to influence decisions and behaviors. So as you've said, I think what we're seeing is that this new toolkit that is available in the biomedical sciences has tremendous dual usability. It can, in fact, be used in ways that are not just towards defined biomedical purposes, therapeutics or prevention, but can also be used in ways that can be highly influential in a variety of contexts. Let me break for a second. The study you mentioned earlier about in-group, out-group, it wasn't exactly that it made them more hostile to the out-group per se, but it certainly made them more amenable and more bonded to the in-group, which gets back to a rather old quote that has been attributed to the German philosopher Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Basically said that if I want people to do certain things that others might think are bad, I don't tell them what's bad. I just teach them what I want them to believe is good. And if we inculcate individuals and collectives with the idea that X is a harmful thing, X is something that is threatening to my kin, my kith, my ideals, my way of life, things that I value, that develops in them a sense of dread against that threat, perceived threat. That dread can then be motivational to be able to increase not only their what they perceive as their vulnerability, but perhaps their volatility. And that volatility can be channeled in a variety of ways, inclusive perhaps of violence, if these individuals then believe that that dread is impending and that threat is very real, is increasing, and must be mitigated or prevented. So the closer I feel to my kin and kith, and the more I cultivate in that in-group antipathy against an out-group, a definable out-group, well, now you've got all the pieces in the puzzle, don't you?
Mhm. Okay, as much as I still have a lot of questions about weaponry, I also I'm aware of the time here, and there's a few things I want to cover. And the first, there's a point that you made in speaking with the two, I think they were Navy fellows on the OODA Loop show, where you're talking about liminal warfare. I think before I get off warfare, liminal warfare, how is that different from any other, what do you call that? I forgot the term for it's not, you're not faced. Yes, thank you. Asymmetric warfare. How is liminal warfare different from a, okay.
There's a component of both symmetrical and asymmetrical warfare. In asymmetrical engagements, let's face it, the nature of warfare is that one side always attempts to be asymmetrically better than the other. Right? I
Right.
mean, realistically, they
That's
want to be evenly matched. As noble and as gallant as that sounds, what you're looking for is advantage. I mean, across the range of human competition, from the sports field all the way to the battlefield, right? Whether it's economics or whether it's bellicosity, there's always that striving for advantage and asymmetry in those engagements that are going to be competitive or conflictive. But even in relatively symmetrical engagements where you have power X that is relatively the same as power Y, what these areas of liminal and subliminal warfare or subliminal engagement allow is to create an engagement or a set of engagements across a broader potential or range of fronts. Some that are exceedingly apparent and overt, and others that are far more subtle, far more insidious, far more influential, and that can be rendered covertly or clandestinely. So what we're seeing is, again, the use of a new toolkit across the potential palette that has been used to engage warfare on the non-kinetic side, which are engagements that are not necessarily bang-bang types of shoot-em-ups, but influential, disruptive campaigns that affect economics, dependencies, power balances, to those things that are far more overt and far more belligerently expressive, bang-bang shoot-em-ups.
Okay, something was said by you in that conversation that wasn't elaborated on, and I thought it was too bad because I was curious to hear more about it. So I'm going to ask. And you made a point that that one needs to separate techne from logos in technology. And I thought that was really interesting and I wanted to hear more. So can you discuss that? Techne is the tools. You said logos. The techne is becoming capable of its own logos. And I thought, wow, there's something in there. I don't know what it is, but I need to know.
Yeah, well, on that particular, and I love that was a great podcast. It was very sort of operationally focused and very quote boots on the ground oriented. I mean, it also got into some really cool headspace stuff. But I think what happened is I drifted off into my sort of professorial realm. I became a little more academic, and that's a bit blue sky esoteric, but it's quite real. I mean, you've made a very important point, and it's something that I really like to drive home to your viewers and to your listeners. I mean, we have conflated the word technical or technique with the word technology. That's been a
Right.
colloquialism, right? What we're really talking about when we're talking about the tools themselves and how we develop those tools and the process then of actually sort of using the tool itself, that comes from a very old ancient Greek term, which is techne, which refers exactly to that. It's the instrument, things that go into building the instrument, and then how that instrument is used, which is both skill and aptitude, and to some extent art that goes into it. But the word technology is not just the tool itself. I mean, I urge people to sort of go back to the roots. I mean, again, I put my professor hat on. When we talk about logos, we're talking here about a rational accounting of something, a rational description, a rational analysis of it. So when we talk about techne logos, I urge my colleagues to do that across a variety of levels. People who I interact with, my students, irrespective of what kind of students they are, and certainly if we're then sort of moving up in the various echelons that I professionally interact with. Techne Logos demands that rational accounting of the intent in building the tool, how the tool is built, not only according to that intent, but with a knowledge of how that intent may be bastardized, perhaps diffused or corrupted intentionally, or simply by distinctions and diversity of uses by various groups, how that tool is being used, how that tool is being regarded, accepted, rejected, perhaps in some cases seen with regard to a larger toolkit. What kind of things does it do? So what I'm prompting, what I'm urging is a far more sort of logocentric orientation to the techne kits and capabilities that we're developing. In other words, what I'm calling for is something that the philosopher Hannah Arendt had called for, which the philosopher Hans Jonas has called for, the philosopher Hans Lenk has called for. It's certainly not new. I can't take credit for it. I just want to be a cheerleader. And if we look at some of the work of Arendt, what she has said is that humans can essentially work in one of two ways. They can put their head down and slave away at something, not coming up and taking stock, not coming up and taking
Mhm.
measure of what it is they're creating and what the creation is being used for, ergo what it is doing in the real world. Or we could be far more sort of creative in our own creation. In other words, we can take credit for the creation as we are creating. She referred to the former as animal laborans, literally working like an animal, and she referred to the latter as homo faber, literally the creative human. And I think it harkens back to an older mythological construct that was very, very popular in the Hebraic literature, which was the golem.
Hmm.
The idea of creating something that's going to work for you. You create this creature. How you create the golem is rich within the story. If you just put your head down and slave away, suddenly when you look up, here's this thing that you've created. What will it do to you, with you, for you? How is it that you're interacting with it? How is it that you're capable of perhaps controlling it or losing control of it? Have you created something unto itself that literally gets away from you? Or are you sort of responsible with regard to dominion, obligation for appreciating not only its intended use, but how that intention might diffuse with time, with various groups, etc.? So I think putting that construct together into a more realistic appreciation of techne logos to be the way we approach technology, literally technology, I think should be the viable marching order.
When you say, and thank you for that, that was interesting. When you say that the techne has become capable of its own logos, when I think of logos, I think of reasoning. So the tool has become capable of its own reasoning. Can you elaborate on that?
AI.
Pardon?
AI, artificial intelligence.
Yes, but
Yeah, I mean, so
I mean
so
that's what we're being sold, but is that true? Because it's still
it's
programmed by humans, it's still with, yeah, so
yeah, yes and no. So
okay.
again, we have to appreciate this sort of iterative spectrum of what these types of machine information processing and ultimately engaging computational and perhaps cognitive capabilities are. So again, we look at something like deep learning and machine learning, very capable. We then look at soft AI, which is taking what humans can do and facilitating it and fortifying it and making things easier. But then as you get into other forms of what used to be referred to as hard AI, you have to appreciate the multidimensionality of artificial intelligence. So you have AI as pure tool.
Mhm.
It's a tool. It's something that we're using. But then increasingly, the tool itself becomes an actor. So now it's not just a tool for action. We're imbuing upon that tool acting capability unto itself. Yeah, obviously, there are various controls where the human is in some way involved with the proverbial loop. We're very comfortable with humans being, quote, in the loop, having some metrics for and being able to keep the pulse, tenor, and tone of what the actor is acting to do as a tool that is perhaps an automatic tool. But increasingly, what we're also seeing is automaticity gives way to relative levels of autonomy, where now the tool is less of a pure actor and becoming ever more an agent to do certain
Mhm.
things. So now the question is, where does the human lie there? Certainly, again, we're very comfortable with humans being, quote, in the loop. But we also recognize the benefits of humans being on the loop so that we allow the relative latitude, capability, speed, depth of function of the AI as a computational and perhaps with certain types of hybrid computation, vertical as well as lateral computation, even cognition. At that point, well, do we really want to interfere with that process and slow it down or impede it or perhaps even bias it in certain ways?
Mhm.
But should we not then meter that? The idea there is, well, humans should be on the loop at key points that allow metrics to be assessed and for humans to intervene. Well, how on the loop? Next to the loop or near the loop? And I'm not just throwing around semantics. These things are not just the hypothetical distances. They represent, well, how close do we need to be with each process? How distant do we need to be? Should we be? Can we be? But then there's also the considerations for humans out of the loop. And although we here in the United States and among many of our international scientific and technological partners and allies are are less comfortable with that as a concept, there are three things that I think need to be remembered. Number one, discomfort with humans out of the loop is not universal. There are certainly other groups that are very comfortable with taking humans out of the loop to allow these AI systems to do what AI systems do without, if you will, human interference in the process or its provenance. Number
Can
one.
you give an example of groups that are comfortable taking humans out of the loop?
Well, I think that there have been certain iterations of AI, particularly increasingly agentic AI, that have been developed, for example, in China, that are seen as taking humans out of the loop to allow a set of processes to evolve within the AI system that would not necessarily be biased, side railed, or detained, or in some way impeded through a regular series of human interventions. So, in other words, what may happen is humans are out of the loop for a period of time and then may be brought back into the loop or on the loop. Again, I think that you can argue, well, are they really out of the loop? But then the question also becomes, what's going on in the loop, in that loop, and how much can humans know about that? Now, I don't want to pull the string here and unravel the sweater, and I don't want to get into any discussions as provocative and I think as fun as they might be, and I think also as contentious as they might be, about the possibility of AI systems developing some form of consciousness. I mean, if you were to put a gun to my head and say, well, do you think that's possible? Yeah, I think it's very possible. And we could spend an entire show talking about how and why I think that's possible. And I can defend that assertion. Do I think they're there yet? Well, to be very honest with you, I don't think we know. And the reason for that is consciousness as a thing is accessible only to the organism that is experiencing it. Consciousness is subjective and it's transparent only to self. So again, it's a question of, well, is there some kind of quasi-Turing test that we're putting to these systems to assess whether their consciousness exists? But one of the problems is we always try to metric that back to human consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no reason in the world to believe or to even suspect that the consciousness of any other organism, whether it's a biological organism or a non-biological organism, would in fact have human consciousness. There's no need for it. However, the point here is, again, that internality of the process of not even consciousness, that process of cognition. Once you build algorithms to a particular point and then set those algorithms onto some iterative path of autonomy, the algorithms will self-correct. They will adapt. You're teaching the thing to learn how to learn. And unless there is continuous transparency and visibility, linguistically, expressionally, in terms of some level of ongoing communication with metrics that are reciprocally understandable, right? You may not have access to what that thing is doing. You may not have access to how those cognitive processes may be working. And this is particularly true as we develop not just the idea of neural networks, which are nothing more than simple architectures, but architectures that engage processes that are not just, quote, neuromorphic, but biomimetic. In other words, these things are really functioning as other types of biological systems so that the individual component parts are computational and potentially cognitive elements as part of the system where the whole is greater than the simple sum of its parts. It creates much more of an integral effect rather than just a summative effect. I mean, this then could hearken discussions, for example, of Ray Kurzweil's singularity, etc. And I don't necessarily want to go there, but I think we're standing at an interesting cusp, a crest, whereby the technologies that we have developed, particularly these informational types of technologies, these forms of advanced machine learning, various forms of AI, are exactly that. They are developing intelligent capabilities of computation, and the sophistication of that computation represents a form of cognition. And at that point, how transparent are those mechanisms of cognition? Are those processes? And there are a number of different elements that come into this. So, for example, where elements of recall orientation are stored and how, increasingly we're moving towards systems that are called non-von Neumann systems, which is that there isn't a designated area for memory storage, but rather it's a function of the constituent units. And you then couple that with the idea that these things function in an iteratively Bayesian way so that they sort of learn from prior experiences and/or erudition, and that now the system itself writ large, not necessarily a single computer, but computational systems, for example, such as the internet, or large-scale generative AI systems, ChatGPT, Claude, for example, have access to tremendous, I mean, myriad information. Essentially, that represents the cumulative total of human contribution to that information base. Well, now you've got a situation where that system knows at least as much about it as we know about it, and perhaps more about us than we know about it. And this is provocative, right?
Mhm.
So when we talk about techne becoming its own logos, I mean, an interesting exercise is to literally ask a form of generative AI to describe what is the logos of its techne. It's kind of interesting. I mean, it's obviously it's purging bunch of information that has been contributed to that concept by humans across whatever time span you provide. But there's nothing that says that that's also not in some way self-referential. And one could ask the very provocative question of these forms of generatively encoded AI as to, well, what is your logos? What is a rational accounting of what you are? What is generative AI like you? And so, whether or not you're saying, okay, yes, that's truly cognitively reflective and therefore represents some form of sentience, or whether you're simply looking at what I'll call information processing in some regurgitant mechanism, I mean, there's still a very realistic definition of a component of logos, if not a logos, that the techne is able to instill and enact upon itself. Hence, my claim to the same.
Very interesting. Thank you.
You're
I'm
welcome.
glad I asked.
I'm glad you asked too.
So I I want to move. I'm going to check my list here and see how we're doing. And I think that's a beautiful segue into the next point that I wanted to talk about with you, and that's consciousness, mind, and thoughts. Because in what you do, you study the brain and you study the physiology, and this is what, neuroethics is the neuro system, but focused on the brain and the ethics around that accompany that. So it's the brain. It's the brain. The brain has a function, but the brain is not the mind. They're two different things. And so how
Well,
did
no, 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 no. I wouldn't
Mhm.
say they're different. I wouldn't say they're different.
Okay.
Uh, and that the problem in saying that they're different sort of devolves back to some form of dualism, and I don't want to go there
Okay.
because I think that there's an error in that. And the error is that I think there needs to be at least some ground truth upon that. Let me explain. We would need, I think, a very formal definition of mind. The one I like to use is that mind represents the totality of functions of the embodied brain in its embeddedness in its environment. Hmm? It, these are all ground truths. Brains exist in bodies. This is not a discussion of AI type brains or
You,
developing cerebral
my
organoids.
brain
And
is
I
in my
think that
body.
yeah, and I think
Yeah.
that these new technologies and these new scientific developments, such as the development of ever more sophisticated and larger organoids, cerebral organoids, might take that discussion in an entirely different and new direction. Absent that, in organisms, in living organisms, their brain, as simple or as complicated as it is, exists in, develops with, grew up with that particular body. And that body and that brain, in other words, that embrained, embodied thing, exists and is inextricable from the reality that it exists in an environment over space and time. So what we're really seeing is that, once again, it goes back to what I refer to as a triune, three things in once. The biological entity, the brain body, the experience of the brain body, the psychology of that, if you will, and the reality of that thing being nested in and existing in some environment on a variety of different levels across its space and time of existence. Okay. That said, mind represents the totality of those functions of the embrained, embodied organism in its environment. Now, the question then is, well, where does mind, what is that? Well, again, there are certain things that occur in a brain, from a brain, that a brain does, but realistically, there is an ongoing interaction between that brain and that body. There is an ongoing interaction between that body as innervated, full of nerves, communicating with that brain in its environment. Are there examples where that may be separated, that may be fractured, there may be a schism? Sure. Individuals who are locked in and can't communicate, individuals who are in various states of being obtunded, comatose increasingly, and perhaps vegetative. But even then, I mean, here we can relate to some of the excellent work of my colleague, Dr. Joseph Fins, who talks about covert consciousness. That now what we're learning is that, oh yeah, there may be some distinction in terms of the brain's ability to perceive and to sense the external environment, but there may still be very active internal processes that are occurring whereby the mental life aspects of consciousness may have differential accessibility to the outside world. Certain things get in, other things being processed internally. In other words, there's still what they call interoceptive. So this is a very rich environment. So the question is really, what can we learn about minds by studying brains, and what can we learn about brains by studying minds? And that's
Okay,
why I think
that's
this way.
interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I have some questions about that. For instance, okay, you're studying somebody's brain through some kind of imaging. And like you see in A Clockwork Orange, you put an image in front of them, and well, that was 50, 60 years ago now, nearly, but you can see that. You can see that how the color red affects a brain. You can see how a certain piece of music affects a brain. But where does the thought come from that you're studying? You're studying a thought and the thought's effect on the brain, but where does the thought come from?
It's a great question. It really, in some ways, it actually gets to the question of, do we have free will?
Yes, which is another important question that I want
Yeah.
to cover with you.
Oh
So,
no, it's a huge question. So I mean, at what point of reduction are we able to say that is the spark of X, where X
right.
is will or X is thought? What is that spark? There is evidence that would suggest if I can stimulate a single neuron, which is very difficult to do in a human, a single neuron, but being able to stimulate a small group of neurons and a very, very tight aggregation of neurons, is that generative of some perceptible sensed experience for the individual? And the answer, it can be yes, certainly. I mean, we know this from a variety of different medical interventions, individuals' various trauma, and I think more recently, some very, very advanced work, not only with neuroimaging, but also with various forms of very, very precise and very specific brain stimulation, most notably indwelling brain stimulation, using very, very specific, very, very small, and very highly precise electrodes. So again, the idea of the initiation of something, well, that's where it starts. But of course, you can keep sort of, you can play the game that 4-year-old children do, which is evidence of their curiosity. What starts that? Okay, but what starts that? Okay, but what starts that? So at some point, there is sort of a default that says, well, are we really nothing more than sort of physiochemical automatons? Okay, yes, but what provides that spark of change? And here, I think it really becomes important to then beg the question, which is something that I'm working on with a colleague of mine in Germany, Professor Dr. Nico Kohls, which is rather than asking the question, well, what is consciousness or what is thought? Flip the question. What is a brain? Or what is an aggregate of nerve cells that is essentially a functioning brain? Even in something as simple perhaps as a housefly or a bee. What is that? In other words, that ganglionic cluster of nerve cells that provides in the central nervous system sort of an aggregate nucleus or a series of clusters in the periphery that converge. What is it doing? What is it actually doing? And so what we're playing with as a thought experiment, huge pun intended, a thought experiment about thought, is, well, perhaps to get to the question of what is that spark of thought? What is that spark that initiates free will, perhaps? Or even if one says, well, free will is nothing more than a physiochemical process, but what we do have is free won't. I've made that argument, the ability to at least inhibit our impulses and drives. Well, then you still have to ask, but where did the impulses and drives come from?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the question that we ask is, well, what is the brain? So, for example, is the brain an antenna? Is it in some way collecting, aggregating some fundamental force of the universe in which
Now
we
you're
live?
getting out into like morphic resonance, the woo world, but it's interesting.
No, 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 no woo.
No,
I'm
okay.
not. I'm not going to go woo. All right.
Okay.
So I mean, I think that there's always a woo potential when you get to the limits of the boundary limits, the size and spatial limits and temporal limits of things like physics. And there's a whole area now called neurophysics, inclusive of the idea that there are aspects of neural systems that may engage certain quantum features, if not functions, which is called neuroquantology. But let's just ask the question, might a nervous system be an antenna? Viably possible. I mean, it has to have a particular structure to do what antennas do. And then it has to take whatever is that fundamental force, channel it in a particular way, and then through that channeling, it is then usable in some other system. That's possible. Okay. Could the brain be a receptacle where, again, some structure is needed, and then once that structure is assumed, it can capture something, some fundamental or even derivative force in the universe that is then viable in that organism because it is a living organism. And in that way, constrains it within that receptacle, shapes it within that receptacle, and as a receptacle, uses as a receptacle for something else to be used in a variety of ways. Is the brain a generator where it actually generates something? It can't generate something completely de novo. Even an electrical generator is not making something brand new. It's making a property, a force that exists in the universe, electricity, but it's creating that by means of the articulation of its mechanics and its parts. Or might it be some combination of all the above? At different stages, perhaps in different species, perhaps in the same species. I mean, there's an old phrase that they teach us as you're coming up through the biological sciences about how development in the womb in some way mirrors development across evolution. The sort of reciprocal capitulation of ontogeny and phylogeny, which is a fancy way of saying it. Could that be that what we're seeing is a human brain that we like to hold as sort of being at the apex of our bioevolutionary development, sort of the top of the pyramid, goes through these stages of box, antenna, and generator because that's what other species do. They just require a box or require an antenna or just require a generator. And although we like to perhaps think, well, the generator is the most complicated, maybe not. Maybe the generator is what's needed to provide the energy to build the box of the antenna to grab hold of something else. It doesn't make the presumption that consciousness is the fundamental force of the universe, although that's certainly out there, whether you consider that to be woo-woo or not. I mean, it is certainly.
Oh, I'm woo. I'm all the
No,
way woo.
there's no sin in woo. I mean, woo is cool, but it does, I think, ground it to the reality that we are physical organisms, physical beings that have physical properties that are responsive and contributory to the physical universe in which we are a part. And we are a part of that. I mean, from the very, very small to the very, very large. And our embeddedness and our investedness and our enfranchisement, physical, functional enfranchisement in that universe would certainly sustain the fact that anything in that physical body would be intuned or attuned to those forces in the universe in some way to be able to do something with them. And that once engaged, entrained within that structure, then create a set of particular functions that are intrinsic to the architecture of that function. Now, that does leave you off at this sort of cognitive cliff of, yeah, all right, but what is it? I mean, it doesn't answer Chalmers' like gazillion-dollar question of the hard question of brain sciences. In other words, what is consciousness? But it sort of answers it in part. It says, okay, and this may be how a brain does that. It doesn't say what that thing is, but at least it sort of regrounds this back across the sciences, the physical sciences, natural sciences, life sciences, and even the social sciences and humanities to some extent. So it's been an entertaining, an intellectual entertaining enterprise with my longstanding colleague and buddy Nico. And what we're hoping to do is to make this applicable not just to organic organisms. In other words, the idea of life forms that are organic, whether they be from a common sea slug or a sea worm, a microscopic organism, all the way up to humans. But might that same construct be, if not homologous, analogous to any other set of structures that are then able to do that, which then opens the door for the possibility of these types of computational cum cognitive to perhaps conscious processes in non-carbon-based, more silicon-based entities such as AI.
Mhm.
And that was our hope.
Let me tell you something that I've experienced and observed, and then tell me what you think. I lived in Canada for years, and in the area that I lived in the summertime, it was very humid and it was just rife with mosquitoes. Horrible. You had to wear netting and the whole thing. And they'd get in the house no matter how careful you were. Now, this is something that I've observed over and over and over. All I had to do was think the thought, I'm going to kill that mosquito. And that mosquito moved away from me. As far as I'm conscious of, I haven't batted an eye, I haven't moved any part of my body. Somehow it has become aware that I am now the predator and I'm coming after it.
As cool woo as I'd like to say, there's some energy. I think on a far more fundamental level, what you're probably giving off is something that there's a change in heat, probably a change in blood flow, and you're also probably giving off a change in pheromone.
Okay.
And other species, I mean, not just mosquitoes, but other species are very, very sensitive to that. I mean, they have to understand their sensory arrays, their sense organs, and their sensorium is very different than that of our own. Therefore, they're sensitive to and responsive to things that we think, oh, there's nothing there. Sure, there is. It's just that we're not aware of it. There's an entire
Yeah.
dimensionality of our physical universe that is simply imperceptible to us. And of course, you have to remember that the survivability of those species, of those individual and collective organisms, is dependent upon those cues.
Yeah.
Now, again, you have to think, well, what's going on? So what's going on is, yeah, I'm thinking about I want to off this mosquito, and as I off this mosquito, I have to mobilize X, Y, and Z resources to do that. And perhaps in doing that, you get pissed off at the mosquito, which then changes literally your nervous system, which then changes the way your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are innervating, for example, the glands that secrete very, very subtle substances in your skin, which then not only change blood flow getting ready to move, but literally may change what pheromones are giving off that are then perceptible to said mosquito. And they're like, we're out of here.
I
So
figured it was something like that. I didn't think it was woo, but it's just so quick. It was always so quick. It's like, there they are. I'm going to kill them. Boom, they're gone.
it's either that or they're reading your mind.
That's
But
scary.
no, I got to tell you, I mean, so that's interesting. This is kind of fun because if we go back to something that we said earlier, which is, well, what mind is, and it's a set of functions that the brain does. Well, there's a component of mind that's physical. And there are aspects of our own physicality that we're not even aware of, but that perhaps others are. Other humans, perhaps, other species, perhaps, right? And as a consequence, it may very well be that others, whether of our own, a conspecific others, our species, our own species, or other animals, are able to, quote, read, literally read, interpret symbols and signals, that's what reading is, that we're giving off that we're not even aware we're giving off.
I heard a little snippet. Somebody had just taken an extract of you talking about something and put up this 3 minutes. I think it was called Apprehension of the Superior Other. And you were talking about science fiction where something recognizes the superior other, the predator, the alien, if you will. Um, how are you set for time here?
I've got about 5 more minutes. And then I
Okay.
have to go off. And then I have to go off and deal with superior others.
Okay.
Roll the
Well,
dice sometimes.
I think we may have to do a follow-up. I read a book that you suggested, Bioethics and Brains,
Oh, that's very nice of you. Thank you.
Disciplined and Principled Neuroethics. And I actually had quite a list of questions that I had about um, ethics and what you're doing. But
Yeah.
I think maybe we can shelve that if you've already said right before I hit record that you'd be willing to talk to me again. So we might hold that for a
Absolutely.
future conversation.
Yeah.
But
Thanks for picking up the book. It was a book that I wrote with a long-standing colleague of mine, my buddy John Shook, Professor John Shook, and we've been involved in sort of neuroethics for well over a decade. And I mean, my work has been decades long. John's been working with me for well over a decade. And we'd like to think that what we've done is we've sort of taken it to the horizon of not just what is probable in the brain sciences, but what that next vista of possibility looks like. And maybe even look a little further to what might be potential. And with such progress, I think comes a real need to be able to at least keep the ethical discourse apace with that.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting. I did read the book. I have quite a list of questions about it. And also, I read some of the papers. I think that at least three of the four papers that you suggested you co-authored with John R. Shook. And I think it's an interesting idea, maybe as a teaser for talking again at some point in the future. Can you tell us what meta ethics is? Because you talk about this a lot, the need to develop a meta ethic for dealing with neuroethics.
Yeah. So, we've made the claim that neuroethics can be a metaethics, not the metaethics, but
Right.
a metaethics. In other words, that it provides you some 30,000-foot view of ethics, not only ethics as a set of practices, but what ethics is. So it's what ethics is and how individuals and groups do ethics, and not just the actual practices of ethics, but the actual mechanisms, the neurocognitive mechanisms that are contributory to our moral cognition that drive our decisions and shape our actions in the context of our various environments. So the reason that we've looked at neuroethics to be potentially meta-ethical is that neuroethics brings to the fore two foci, two sort of interacting areas of engagement. One is somewhat colloquially the neuroscience of ethics. In other words, what neurocognitive processes are involved when individuals and groups engage in moral thought, moral emotion, driving moral decisions, moral actions, responding to others morally. In other words, how is it that we engage? But if what we're doing is applying neuroscience to the study of our moral thought and our moral actions individually and communally, then clearly one of the imperatives, an obligation, a responsibility, is to conduct that neuroscience in ways that is ethically sound and morally apt, and to seek to develop ethical uses for the knowledge and capabilities of that neuroscientific information and its tools. So therefore, you sort of get the doublement of ethics. It's the neuroscience of ethics, more realistically put, the neuroscience or neuroscientific investigations of those neurological and cognitive processes that are intrinsic to moral thought, moral decisions, moral actions. But then also, what are the moral and ethical systems, applications, adjudications, and practices for guiding, governing that research and the way that research is used in a variety of different applications? So again, it's meta-ethical in that those two construct components work reciprocally and in synergy.
Well, it was a very interesting book. I mean, I think that I told you in an email. I probably didn't say it so frankly, but I don't know anything about ethics. I didn't say that in the email, but my whole foray into ethics is, which I also mentioned in an email, is I had reason to read Thomas Huxley and then Julian Huxley's essays that they had delivered in 1898 and then in, I think, 1948 on ethics, evolution, evolutionary ethics and evolution. And I, that really was my introduction to ethics. Never thought about it, just never thought about it. And so reading,
Introduction, no?
pardon?
Great introduction.
It was a great introduction. It was very thought-provoking, frustrating, I have to admit, in places, because I didn't agree with them and I could get, but I didn't have that frustration in reading your book. I mostly had a lot of questions and a lot of things that I was very curious about. It was interesting to me, just as for instance, to learn that there is no legal definition for free will. Free will is not a legal construct, it's not a legal argument. And yet we talk about it all the time. Well, we got to have free will, free will. And so it made me ponder free will in a way that I had not before.
Yeah, I mean, so again, it's sort of like the commercial for the hotel chain. I'm not a lawyer, but I got a pretty good night's sleep last night. And we don't venture too deeply into this field called neuro law. There are some very, very good scholars, legal scholars, who are also neural and cognitive scientists. And that field is very, very rich. I mean, people like Hank Greeley, Nita Farahani, certainly Francis Shen. These are leaders in that field of neuro law, which again, I think is sort of multi-perspectival. It deals with those ways that the law can approach the neurosciences and appropriate, use, and in some cases, either discern or defend certain neuroscientific information, definitions, and its utility and value in the courtroom. But also, what are the laws that then govern the uses or misuses of neuroscience and or the conduct of neuroscientific research? So in that way, there's something of a meta-legal construct to it as well. But to be clear, one of the things you're seeing is that there's no uniform legal definition of free will. And that's an issue because here too, I think it represents some variability as to what constitutes demonstration of free will. So even something as relatively superficial and or simplistic as, quote, the insanity defense would suggest that the individual does not necessarily have cognizance or at that particular point some level of awareness of the consequences of their action and therefore are not capable of exercising at least free won't to be able to then suppress their impulses and drives to do X, where X may be illegal. The other aspect is whether or not the individual has neurocognitive and or psychiatric capacity, which is then renderable to the legal construct of competence. Are they compos mentis? And there's a number of things that can go along with that. I mean, literally, do they have cognitive capability, or is their reasoning process in some way flavored or distorted, again, by some absence of their ability to inhibit their desires and actions? So I think what you tend to see is that in the neuro-legal context, differing definitions or perspectives on what free will is or free will isn't, and or to what level one might want to argue free will exists, can be problematic. But what I will tell you is that what has been a relative anchor is the legal tenet, the ability to sort of glom onto and employ a viable definition of free won't.
Mhm.
In other words, that given, quote, compos mentis, if you will, and I'm using the term in a quasi-legal way, compos mentis, capability, mental
Mhm.
capability to
Mhm.
understand consequences of one's decisions and actions and or to control them. What that demonstrates is that responsibility can rest upon demonstrable inhibition of actions. So it may not have to argue with, well, where does free will come from and do we really have it or are we
Mhm.
biological automatons? It can certainly rest upon the neurobiological definition and discernment that we do have inhibitory capability and how functional, how viable, how strong, and how capacitous is that.
Thank you. I just have to say there I will have a part two because we didn't talk about ethics. We didn't talk about your book. We didn't talk about all the myriad questions I had around that. We did not talk about cognitive enhancement. We didn't talk, yeah, we next time transhumanism, post-humanism, what is a human? So just a whole stack of questions there that we can explore next time. But your 5 minutes to go meet your superior other have passed. So I thank you very much for taking the time. I'm sure that you will all find this as interesting as I did, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Melissa, for your interest in my work, for your enthusiasm for it, and really thanks to all of your audience for taking the time to spend some time with me. And hopefully they find the stuff that I do interesting, informative, maybe a little provocative and contentious, and that's good.
And scary.
I mean, I think being a little scared, particularly of those things that should scare you, is also worthwhile. And some of this is scary.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Giordano, I really appreciate your time. Thank you again, and I look forward to having that follow-up conversation.
Too. Talk to you soon.
All right.
Well, I've got something that the world didn't give me, and the world cannot take it away. And I've got something that the world didn't give me, and the world cannot take it away. Well, it is love, sweet love, oh, sent to me from my Father up above.